Hi, I'm Max Scott, Marketing and Events Manager for CORE. We're excited to welcome you to the Collective in Snowmass Village, Colorado for the official kickoff of Imagine Climate 2021 Creative Perspectives on Climate Change. Thanks for joining us for tonight's performance of DJ Spooky's Arctic Rhythms and a conversation about art as a language for science. We couldn't let a little thing like a global pandemic slow us down, so Imagine Climate 2021 is packed with ways for you to join the climate conversation. All of our events this year are a mix of outdoor, self-guided, virtual, and indoor limited capacity. Throughout March, leading artists, inventors, and changemakers will share their creative perspectives on the climate through a series of bicultural events. This year's lineup includes the Stories of Climate Change, Historias del Cambio Climático mural project, a scavenger hunt and interactive photo station, the Nested Roots art exhibit opening at the launch pad, a soundtrack for climate action curated by the Arts Campus at Willits, Regeneration Imagining the Future multimedia art exhibition opening at Colorado Mountain College, 5 climate films for the future curated by 5 Point Film, and finally Community Meeting 2021 plugging into your climate future from the Basalt Library. Thanks to the support of our community partners, all the events this year are free and open to the public. See the full lineup at aspencore.org or use the hashtag ImagineClimate on social media. To show our appreciation for you joining the climate conversation, we're giving away an e-bike from Basalt Bike and Ski. All you have to do to enter is participate. Get your first entry by clicking the link below, filling out the form, and showing your commitment to climate change. Here to tell you a little more about CORE, Imagine Climate Director, Laura Whitley.
Hi, Mac. I'm on site this morning at Colorado Mountain College in Carbondale. Our team is putting the finishing touches on the Stories of Climate Change, Historias del Cambio Climático mural project that CORE is excited to present as part of its 3rd annual Imagine Climate. I'm stoked to tell you a little bit more about CORE. We're the Community Office for Resource Efficiency, and for more than 25 years we've been helping residents of the Roaring Fork Valley cut carbon and save energy. Our mission is to lead the Roaring Fork Valley to a net zero carbon-free energy future. And we do that by helping folks lower their carbon footprints in their spaces, whether it's at work or at home. The mural project is the centerpiece of the 3rd annual Imagine Climate. This is the 1 month out of the year where CORE steps out of its technical box and uses art as a tool for social change. It's one of our creative strategies to bring together art, environment, and community. You might wonder why an energy nonprofit, an organization that's not an arts-based organization, is working in the arts. It's because we see the power that art has to open people's minds to new possibilities. In the environmental world, sometimes we're preaching to the choir, and we recognize it's going to take all of us to solve the climate crisis. So we like to say that in order to get beyond the choir, we've got to step out of the church. And we do that by reaching out to other organizations, bringing in a new group of folks, artists, scientists, inventors, innovators, to work with us and give a broader perspective on what climate solutions and climate action can look like. So thanks for joining us. Enjoy the show.
30 local organizations, several artists, a few scientists, and a climate czar joined 29 advisory council members and 89 locals to make 2021 the biggest year yet for collaboration. Imagine Climate 2021 wouldn't happen without our presenting partner, Colorado Mountain College, who not only shared with us their building and the talents of their team, but also a philosophy of environmental stewardship, innovation, and leadership. We'd like to thank all the partners that made Imagine Climate possible this year: Alpine Bank, Susan H. Brady, Holy Cross Energy, and all of the community organizations, local businesses, nonprofits, and local governments that came together and brought Imagine Climate to life. Paul D. Miller is a composer, writer, and multimedia artist whose work immerses audiences in a blend of genres and a mix of global, social, and environmental issues. Paul was named an Emerging Explorer by National Geographic in 2014, an honor bestowed on those who are on the forefront of solving global problems. Paul is joined today by Ross Cribbs and Roberto Arundel, professional performing artists and teaching musicians here in the Roaring Fork Valley, for a performance of Paul's original piece, Arctic Rhythms. Here to tell you a little more about the project is the man himself, Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky.
This piece is called Of Water and Ice. The geometric form of ice is actually just water in a different state. And the temperature differentials that make water become ice are a kind of variable depending on how the temperatures work wherever you are. Humidity, temperature differential, and of course, the way the molecules form. It's stunningly beautiful. And I think that water on one form of ice is cool, and water in its own form of steam or vapor or clouds. All of that is nature just expressing itself through different temperature differentials. So to me at least, depending on where you are, ice will actually form in different states. For example, if you're in Aspen and you want to go skiing, you want a certain kind of powdered ice, which forms at a very specific temperature. And anybody who wants to get more technical, go skiing and you'll see what I'm talking about. This song was inspired by this gentleman. His name's Johannes Kepler. He was on his way home in 1611 and in the middle of a snowstorm, and a piece of ice landed on his sleeve, and he was blown away by the geometry of the ice and went home and wrote this essay, 6 Sides of a Snowflake. And it's generally considered to be the first major mathematical treatise on geometry in nature. So what I did was look at some of his equations and then put them into a format that would work with a musical component. And the video material that you're going to be seeing is taken from different kinds of water. There's not one kind of water. There's hard water, there's acidic water, you name it. And what's beautiful about that is that as soon as the temperatures get to a certain specific range, they become ice and they become all sorts of geometries. So those variables between something that's liquid versus solid, molecular structure, all of that inspires the song that you're about to hear. And the actual electronics were generated using material from Johannes Kepler. For all of the songs that you've heard today, each of them has a relationship to Kepler's work and then the notion of geometry of ice. And for me at least, that's the beauty of all of this. And you never know. There's always that eerie sensibility of how nature, whether you look at these temperature differences and then make them become music with an algorithmic musical transcription, your average person is not going to know the technical aspect of that, but they need to be able to experience it and then understand what is in tune or perhaps out of tune with nature. So with that said, thank you guys so much, and here's the next song. So this next piece is called ice sonification, and the reason I'm calling it sonification is the basic root word is sono, sound. It's a Latin term, and behind me, this is one of the first sound systems. It's from 1915. The gentleman on the left is Luigi Russolo. He's a gentleman who sort of helped create an art movement called the Futurists. And what he would do is have concerts representing the sound of a city. So he wanted to actually show how you would be able to do an acoustic portrait of an urban landscape. So what I've done is taken that concept and bounce it through a couple other approaches and taken the same idea but applied it to data. So this is some of the data generated of the temperature differentials when I was in Antarctica. And what I ended up doing, and the reason we're calling this ice sonification, is that ice is a very geometric form. And if you actually think about it, what I've done is taken those data points and assigned them to tones on a keyboard so that you can hear the spectrum of the different temperatures, and then done what you call an algorithmic musical transcription. So algorithms are important for my work and for any electronic musician. And you have to really think about the way that math, science, nature, and of course human poetry kind of intersect. As much as possible, I'm an artist that thinks about patterns in nature and in life. DJing is about patterns, it's beats, tempos, and so is weather. Weather is patterns. So once you kind of get the sensibility of that, you just map one metaphor over the other, and you're good to go. So this next piece is called ice sonification, and the geometry you're going to be seeing is derived from ice like this, where you actually see very precise mathematical, fine-tuned, hyper-real. This is a very, very specific image of ice at a molecular level. And this is Iceberg Slim, who's an African-American writer. And ice in Black culture has always got a sense of humor about that. Some people will call themselves Ice T or Ice Cube, in hip hop. And so the metaphor of cold as ice is always a thing in urban culture and hip hop and so on. But we take the math that I was showing you, those data points, and then we can use them to begin to generate fractals. And you can easily see that ice is actually a very precise mathematical phenomena in nature. In fact, nature is filled with mathematics at every level. So thanks, and here we go with the next song. this next piece is called Antarctic Rhythms. And basically, I do photography, graphic design, and I'm a writer and I'm an artist. So much of this work is at what you call interdisciplinary. So behind me, this is a landscape taken near the Antarctic Peninsula when I was in Antarctica. And there is a catch. You can easily see that it's a tremendous amount of water. And that water shouldn't be there. It actually should be ice. So you're seeing an image of devastation. And this next piece is called Antarctic Rhythms. And one of the things about, again, African-American music, hip-hop, techno, dubstep, you name it, is polyrhythms. You have many rhythms going simultaneously. So you'll have a hip-hop tempo, which is generally from like 85 BPM, it's slow, to like maybe 100. Then you get to techno, which is faster, like boom, 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 130, 140 BPM, and so on. But so too with nature. So the human time scale of our lifetime, our average human lifespan is like 70 years old, 80, or in the lifespan of a planet that's over 4 billion years old, that's a speck of dust. So the reason I'm calling this Antarctic Rhythms is that this entire continent is melting at a human pace, whereas it's actually should be existing in geologic time, millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And what you can't see with this kind of ice being melted and destroyed is that the human sense of time versus the geologic sense of time are so out of sync that you would have to imagine, like, how would you match that beat if you were a DJ? So these are things that sort of linger over this song. It's called Antarctic Rhythms. The classical music is written in one tempo, the hip hop's in another tempo, the electronics are in another tempo, but they mesh, and that's kind of the point. So polyrhythm and polytempo. And well, thanks for checking it. Here we go. here we are at the end of this concert, and I want to say thank you guys for checking in the vibe here. So behind me you have a vocabulary made of ice. It just says global warming. But when you think about it, all the component elements of that language, that the way we put together words and actions and thoughts, it's all about how we rearrange these component elements, much like the music that I was playing earlier tonight, or today. So each of these is a vocabulary that we need to build a better way of thinking about climate change and better critical tools for critical thinking. So software is a tool. These laptops and iPads and everything we use are tools. They intervene in these, think about how much plastic is made for these computing devices and, metals, and wars in Congo, for example, where you have child soldiers getting, crazy metals, rare earths in the mines of Congo. Horrible stuff that just becomes a consumer device for you to use. So I'm inspired as much by thinking about the way that the global supply chain works as I am for artists like Sun Ra and John Cage. I know that's a big leap to connect those two, but this is a very rare album cover I have. These are two of my favorite composers. John Cage was the first to write a piece for turntables. In the 1930s, he wrote a piece called Imaginary Landscape, where an audience, much like you all, went into a room where there was a bunch of skipping record players and radios tuned to unknown frequencies. So it was like records were skipping, and a lot of people would say that that's considered to be the first DJ sort of composition. It was called Imaginary Landscape. So what we're doing today is a kind of an update of that. Sun Ra and John Cage, when they met, they made this album together, and it was fascinating because they were so nervous that they didn't actually play. They just stared at each other and they recorded the silence. So tonight is kind of a pun on that and the notion of the internet and digital media and the arts. When you have a string quartet playing halfway across the country in the middle of a mountain range, and I'm here in downtown New York, and you all are dispersed all over the internet, that's very 21st century. So I just want to say thanks to everybody for tuning in. And in the spirit of John Cage and Sun Ra, just want to say it's all how we can reimagine what is possible. So thanks everybody, and please try and think about climate change in relationship to so many of the issues facing us. The pandemic, forest fires, melting glaciers, it's all connected. So thank you.
As you can see, art is an amazing way to visualize math and science. Or as Albert Einstein once said, the greatest scientists are artists as well. We want to dive into that concept a little deeper with a conversation about art as a language for science with DJ Spooky and local leaders who live and thrive in the mix of the two worlds.
Thanks, Mac. And Paul, thank you so much for that riveting performance of Arctic Rhythms. It gets me every time, and I'm so proud to have it as part of Imagine Climate. We're here now with two friends. I'm pleased to introduce Amanda Schochet, who grew up in the area, is a former researcher at NASA, a TED speaker, and co-founder of Micro Museums, where she's building a fleet of 6-foot-tall museums. Her team of scientists, designers, engineers, and storytellers take a vast, complex world and squeeze it down into boxes the size of vending machines, if you can believe that. They then put these micro museums into communities that you might call museum deserts, making sure that everyone has access to knowledge. Amanda, it's great to see you.
Great to see you.
And I'm happy to introduce my longtime friend, Harry Teague. Harry is an award-winning architect. He is the founder of a firm of the eponymous name Harry Teague Architects. He's an illustrator and a photographer. Among his iconic buildings are the original log cabin Aspen Community School, where we met, Benedict Music Tent, Harris Concert Hall, and Aspen Country Day School. Harry has also served as president of the former International Design Conference of Aspen. Harry, I'm so glad to have you with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here, Lara.
Yes. So mostly, I'm excited to jump into this conversation about art and science. We're going to have a lot of fun today with this great crew of folks whose lives and livelihoods overlaps this area. All of us are working with science, telling a story through scientific understanding. Paul, in Arctic Ice, you're investigating the geometry of ice, turning math equations into sound patterns to make music. Amanda, your museums illustrate complex science concepts, from invertebrate biology to the law of conservation of energy, to create public jewel boxes of knowledge. Harry, your work transforms physics, geometry, and building science into livable, workable spaces of everyday beauty. And Core's work in energy performance of buildings draws on the first law of thermodynamics, which we try to bring to life through Imagine Climate and other creative strategies. So here's the question. How important is storytelling, and specifically the storytelling of science, in your work? Paul, can I go to you first?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of putting architects and people who are involved with museum design involved, thinking about the role of composers right now, is that we really are at a moment of uncertainty as our culture is sort of reeling under the impact of COVID and the pivot that everyone has had to a more digital social environment. But I have a fun image I just want to show you guys really quick. And this one is of two of my favorite guys. There's a kind of a legacy about science and math and poetry that I really want to just invoke at the beginning of the whole conversation as a nice palate cleanser. This is kind of a legacy of a conversation between these two gentlemen, Einstein and Rabindranath Tagore, who are two of my favorites. They met backstage at the Nobel Prize Awards. And Einstein, when he had a kind of a writer's block, he would go play violin. He was actually quite a talented violinist. And Rabindranath Tagore was the first South Asian to win the Nobel Prize for poetry. And much of Sanskrit and Bengali poetry is based on math. So these two are hanging out backstage and they get to a conversation about music and tuning systems. And they ended up writing a book together called On the Nature of Reality. So I like to use that as a kind of a fun thing of when a scientist talks with a creative and poet, all sorts of different trajectories can come into play.
Amanda, how about you? How important is storytelling? And I think this one plays to you, the storytelling of science in your work.
I learned from being a researcher that the bottleneck really isn't the science. There's a lot of, really amazing scientists, researchers who understand what's going on in the world. We're trying to weave it into our, societal and policy decisions, and they're hitting other kinds of bottlenecks. So that's what got me into doing science communication, like trying to explain to more people, bring more people into the conversation, help kind of integrate more people into just seeing what our future looks like and acting to get it onto a track that we can actually all live with and live in. And storytelling has really been essential to that. If I made a museum that was just a list of facts, it wouldn't resonate with people and they wouldn't remember it. And, if you look, if you ask people today, my age or older, like to say who's Baloo or who's Simba, there's all these names that we just know that we learned as kids because they were characters in stories. So you can have these, there's probably 30 or 40 or 50 names that many of us, all of us know because they were essential to stories that we heard when we were kids. That's how I feel about teaching these kinds of system inroads or facts about the world that we live in, inviting people in to think about it in that way. Like if you weave it into a story, it becomes sticky. People can talk about it. People can engage with it in their, in their own way, with their own minds, and remember it for decades.
I love that idea of stickiness. And that's certainly something that I think of, the way that stories and art in general, they enter us through an emotional portal, not through a mind, not through our minds. And so I think that lends itself to the stickiness. Harry, I wonder if you consider storytelling to be part of your work as an architect or as a photographer.
Oh, that's a good question, because people don't usually think of architecture as a storytelling medium. We're in the boundary between art and practicality, as you mentioned in the introduction. And I think that having actually telling a story is not immediately apparent, but it's what separates sort of mundane, practical architecture from something that, more important is its ability to communicate. And in my work, for example, I always make a very strong attempt at connecting the building to topography and landscape and geography and geology, et cetera, in ways that both, and this is a fundamental role of an artist in a way, is to reveal things that aren't immediately apparent to everybody. Not that we set out to do that, but we wind up doing that. And so in my work anyway, I attempt to sort of illustrate, for example, in the campus for the Country Day School and the Music School Festival, it's revealing the underlying geology of the surrounding area, and in a way that then maybe even foretells the ultimate condition of that.
That's a great segue for me, because our next question I want to explore is an artist who has participated in Imagine Climate in the past. She's a young artist named Jill Pelton. And she has said that art has a uniquely articulate lens to communicate science. So I'd love to hear what it is about art, much more than science alone, that has the power to change our minds. And Paul, you were going to say something, so I'd like to go over to you.
I'm using it up. There's a whole bunch of research that's been coming up lately about the notion of play and learning. And there's a neuroscientist researcher named Catherine Purvis who discovered a really interesting fact, or at least while she's in studies. I mean, it's not like locked down, but someone like Malcolm Gladwell will say, okay, you need a certain amount of time to master an instrument. But they've actually studied the brain and how the formation of neural synapses. So something like 400 repetitions will generate a new learning experience. But if you play, it only takes 20. So the brain actually forms much more meaningful and stronger synaptic connections in play. And there's another famous phrase where you can learn more about someone in an hour of play than a year of just being in an office with them, So there's a kind of a sense of playfulness and irreverence at the core of some of the work I do.
Well, I love that take, that play, it's not just that the artist is being playful, but that it's received in a playful way. And that gets back to Amanda's sense of stickiness, right? So Amanda, how about you? What do you think about this notion that art, much more than science alone, might have the power to change our minds?
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate this concept that Paul is just talking about of, if we're playing or we're looking, art kind of engages us in it engages our curiosity, and it invites our brains to think in a more plastic way when we're engaging just immediately, like cerebrally or intellectually with the topic. So I think helping us to have to be open to all these different perspectives, or inviting us to explore our own curiosity is very similar to a scientific kind of thinking. You go in with structured curiosity and you really observe. And if you try to observe with your preconceived notions of what should happen, then you might be, corrupting your experiment or your observations. You really have to go in with this same kind of perspective and just start seeing what's in front of you using different kinds of methods. So I think that there's a lot of essential cross-pollination between these different fields, or these different ways of using our brains. It really does converge.
I couldn't agree with you more. Curiosity is really and provoking curiosity specifically is really at the heart of Imagine Climate. We see that art can help people connect the dots, and it makes things more meaningful, personal, powerful, and that's where the seed of change is. Harry, what are your thoughts on this notion about art provoking change?
Well, I think Amanda hit it very squarely on the head, is that you don't want to be too literal about this. It's not, especially in my form of art, it's not a literal art form. It's one that exposes things and then lets the observer move. And I'd say we haven't talked about this, but there's the role of the artist being the observer and using techniques to look at things that aren't digital or verbal or data driven or whatnot. They're in fact, they look at things, as Amanda was saying, with sort of let go of those things. Look at these things with a very different kind of part of our brain, which is wonderful. And that then gets translated into work, which then gets understood and appreciated by an audience.
I'd love to just, while we're on the topic of observation, and just to bring it to our issue of climate change, is just something that everyone can do, which is in the spring, just look at when the bees come out. Look for different kinds of bees and see, bumblebees or your native bees, which might be shiny and green. But when they start coming out, see if they're coming out at the same time that the flowers are blossoming. Because something that we are observing with climate change with, 100 years of data is that, a lot of the bees wake up in the spring or come alive in the spring based on temperature, for example, whereas the plants in their area, blossom based on number of daylight hours. So their ancient pairing has been delinked in many cases. And that's the kind of observation that, every one of us can go out into our yards or can look for when we're on the street, and we can, we are all observers of what's going on in the world.
That notion of citizen science is fantastic. And I think we all have the potential to be citizen artists as well. I think sometimes people have imposter syndrome and think that's not for me. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an artist, but I'm not a believer in that. There's many doorways. And on that note of doorways, Paul, I remember the first time we met, and I was trying to explain that CORE is not an art organization, that we're an energy nonprofit, and that we don't have the luxury of making art for art's sake. And you quickly schooled me and let me know that the role of art, well, this is what I remember, is that it provides the opportunity for us to change the way we think and create new patterns of thinking, and that begets new patterns of doing. And that leads me to the next question, which is, what do you hope your audiences will do after experiencing your work? And is action, using art as a tool for social change, important to you?
Sure. I mean, for me, very, very explicitly, my goal in my work at Micro is to help influence people's actions. That goes from, how we vote, how we engage with our communities. One of the biggest things I really hope people see and then act on is just that no matter where you are, in the middle of New York City or out in the wilderness, like, you're part of an ecosystem. You're part of many, many systems, and and our treatment of them really does matter. So the micro museums end with action guides for people to take that we kind of think of as like gateways to being maybe more engaged in conservation, energy conservation, things like that.
Well, as I've said in the previous answer to the previous questions, I don't try to be too literal, and I also don't expect, in a way, a rather literal response to my work. In that it's not, it wasn't conceived in that way, and I don't expect people to respond to it in that way. On the other hand, it is conceived with a passion and enthusiasm for natural environment and the social environment and the historic environment. I mean, all three of them all wrapped together, and that enthusiasm becomes an inspiration for the people that experience the building. And whether it's in conjunction with music or whether it's in conjunction with other artistic activities, let's say at Anderson Ranch, somewhere like that, which you didn't mention, but I'm very proud of that facility that we had a large part to do with. And so it's a location for artists to work and an audience of sorts of people experiencing the various forms of art.
I certainly think that that's one of the powers of art well done, is that it is sometimes more of an immersive or osmotic experience, right? That it doesn't hit you over the head. It works more slowly and sometimes more slowly. But
I have the advantage of having a captive audience a lot of the time, right? People have to be indoors, it's cold outside. Or they're in there to hear a concert or whatever, to do some work. And so you get them over a period of time. It's not a one-shot deal.
The 20th century still has a deep hold on the imagination of the 21st. And we're trying to just sort of figure that out. And the pandemic actually, ironically enough, has pushed us further into a digital context because it's displaced a lot of the normal social forms that people would have consumed music or consumed culture. And I think that on one hand is a healthy thing, but it's also made people rethink architecture. The same with the 1918 pandemic. People had to rethink social space. They had to rethink every aspect of interacting with their fellow human being, just put everything on pause for a moment. And that moment of reflexivity is something I think about that art, strangely enough, gives us. Like, it can say that another world is possible, take a moment and reflect. So hopefully that's what people will be kind of riffing on with some of the music they might have heard from the concert.
I think I'd be interested to hear, maybe Lara, from you or from Aspen Core, like what can we do? Like, part of the art focus is to raise awareness and to get people to think about a different future. But then what do we do once we have that awareness raised?
Thanks for that question. It's actually rooted in science. And that is, we suggest that people get an energy assessment for their space, whether it's their workspace or their home space, because what we need are baselines, right? We need to know how systems are performing so that we can improve them. So that's the first step. And folks that's what our organization and CLEAR in Garfield County are set up to do, to help people get on the way. In Pitkin County, 63% of carbon emissions come from buildings. So there's room for impact when people are ready for action. So thank you all again. That is a perfect ending today, that another world is possible and that you were conjuring the imagination. And I appreciate that all three of you in your work conjure the imagination, because that is at the heart of Imagine Climate. I like to say that we try to capture the imagination to capture participation, because it's so important is more people getting involved, whether, as Amanda, you said, they are voting, right? Or Harry, you said they're, a slow transformation in these buildings, recognizing one's relationship to the natural world. I just really appreciate the work you've done, the work you continue to do, and the insights you've shared with us today. And I hope everybody watching will take that to heart and find their own path forward. So thank you.
This was just the beginning of our shared climate journey, and we want to invite you to take part in the rest of Imagine Climate. Check out the Stories of Climate Change, Historias del Cambio Climático mural project on CMC campuses in Glenwood Springs, Carbondale, and Aspen. And see the full lineup of events at aspencore.org/imagineclimate. Thanks for hanging out with us today. We look forward to seeing you at future Imagine Climate events.